Jonas Reed was following the familiar trail to check his animal traps. Then he froze, catching a strange sound, a faint, choking moan, like the cry of a creature on the brink of death. Jonas moved closer. In the middle of the dry brush, caught in his rusted iron trap, was not an animal, but an Apache woman. She was tall, with a strong muscular build, but now, she was covered in blood. Her lower leg was clamped in the trap, and blood had soaked into the dirt beneath her. Her sun-darkened skin was coated in dust, and her long black hair clung to her sweat-drenched face. She looked up, and in her deep black eyes, fear and despair burned bright. As Jonas stepped forward, her trembling hand reached out, and her broken, raspy voice came through. "Please, help me. But I beg you, do not violate me. Do not lay me on a bed. That is forbidden for a woman who has been cast out, like me." In that moment, time seemed to freeze. Jonas stood still for a while. Then, his rough, calloused hand reached for the trap. The cold steel in his eyes softened just a little. With a sharp click, the trap snapped open. The woman collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Jonas lifted her up, her body heavy, trembling, and turned toward the direction of the cabin. The old wooden cabin sat nestled at the foot of the mountain, where Jonas Reed had lived in solitude for many years. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm golden glow across the smoke-darkened walls. On the rough bed covered with a wool blanket, Tayanita lay still, her leg wrapped loosely in clean cloth. The wound was still oozing blood. Her face was tense, and her deep black eyes never left Jonas. Every time he stepped closer, she flinched slightly, like a cornered animal. Jonas did not say much. He placed a bowl of water next to her, added a few slices of dry bread, then turned away, leaving her to decide for herself. He was used to silence. But this silence felt different, tight, suffocating, as if one spark could set it all ablaze. That evening, the wind howled through the wooden walls. Jonas sat by the fire, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the flames, though he was not really seeing them. Behind him, he heard a soft rustle. Tayanita was trying to sit up, reaching for a piece of bread. Her fingers were trembling, but she bit into it fiercely, like someone who had gone hungry for days. Jonas did not turn around. He simply nodded to himself. At sunrise, he led the horse out of the stall and prepared water for the cattle. Through a crack in the door, Tayanita watched, her eyes filled with both caution and curiosity. This man was nothing like the others she had met. No cages, no commands, just quiet living, and allowing her to exist in whatever space she needed. As evening fell, Jonas returned with an armful of firewood. Stepping into the cabin, he saw her fumbling with the stove. Her hands were large and strong, but clumsy. Smoke poured upward, stinging her eyes. She spun around, gaze sharp with challenge. "I do not need you." Jonas said nothing. He simply stepped forward, pulled out one stick, gently blew on the ember, and the fire sparked to life. Placing the stick back, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, stunned. That night, while the wind screamed outside in bursts, three things coexisted within the small cabin: fear, caution, and the faintest seed of trust. Jonas lay on the long bench, eyes staring at the ceiling, listening to the uneven sound of Tayanita's breathing behind him. And for the first time in many years, the cabin was no longer completely empty. In the days that followed, the small cabin slowly took on a different rhythm. Tayanita, though still cautious, had started getting out of bed, hobbling around the room. Her bandaged leg caused her pain, but her eyes still burned bright, never willing to show weakness. At first, she simply sat in silence in a corner, watching Jonas work. He sawed wood, hauled water, fed the cattle, all with the calm efficiency of a man used to living alone. But Tayanita's eyes, though she tried to hide it, followed his every move. One morning, as Jonas was tidying up the kitchen area, he was surprised to find the pot already filled with water and ready to boil. On the table, a few pieces of firewood had been stacked clumsily, but neatly. She said nothing, turning her face away, as if denying the small effort. Jonas said nothing either, just gave a slight nod, then went back to work. On the third day, he saw her trying to lift the axe to split wood. Her arms were strong, but her movements were awkward. The blade struck at an angle, sending a chunk of wood flying, nearly hitting her foot. Jonas rushed over and grabbed the axe handle. Their eyes locked his, cold gray. Hers, deep and dark. The tension was thick, almost explosive. But then he simply pushed her hands back gently and set the axe down. You do not need to push yourself before you have healed. Jonas's voice was low, firm. Tayanita pressed her lips together, pride burning in her gaze. But that evening, he noticed the firewood had been stacked more neatly than before. Little by little, the distance between them began to shrink. They still spoke little, but the silence was no longer heavy. Shared meals became more familiar. Tayanita ate slowly, and once, when she looked up, she caught Jonas quietly sliding an extra piece of meat onto her plate. She looked surprised for a moment, then turned away, hiding a faint, uncertain smile. Another time, when Jonas was outside repairing the fence, a strong gust of wind blew the window open. Tayanita limped over and struggled to close it. Her rough hand pressed against the wooden frame, holding it shut until Jonas returned. When he stepped inside, her forehead was damp with sweat, but her eyes dared him. "I am not weak." Jonas looked at her longer than usual. He said nothing, simply took her calloused hand away from the window and handed her a dry cloth. And for the first time, Tayanita did not pull back. Day by day, the cabin that once held only the presence of a solitary man now carried another breath, rough, proud, but very much alive. Neither of them had said it out loud, but both had taken the first steps on the path toward trust. One rainy night, the wind howled down from the mountains, lashing against the tin roof of the cabin with long, mournful wails. In the fireplace, the flames crackled softly, casting a warm orange glow on the wooden walls scarred with old bullet marks. Jonas sat by the window. A dusty banjo rested quietly at his feet. His eyes stared out into the black curtain of rain. Across the room, on the bed, Tayanita lay silent, her dark eyes wide open, unable to sleep. The sound of the rain stirred something in both of them, memories they would rather forget. Jonas spoke, his voice rough, like wind moving through stone. "I once had a family, a wife, and a son who never got the chance to be born. One winter, a plague swept through. I watched them go, all of them. And since then, it has been just me in this house." He paused. His hand trembled slightly as he held his cigarette. In that silence, Tayanita turned toward him, her gaze fixed. The firelight softened her weathered face, making her eyes seem even deeper. After a long moment, she whispered, her voice breaking like dry twigs. "I lost everything too. They called me a curse. Because for years I could not bear children. They saw me as a burden, a reason for the tribe's decline. My husband abandoned me. Even my own blood cast me out." As the words left her, Tayanita's broad shoulders trembled. Years of pride, years of hardened wounds, cracked open like shattered glass. Jonas did not come closer. He did not offer comfort. He simply nodded, eyes of cold steel fixed on the fire. Two people, a rancher who lost his family, and an Apache woman cast away, sat in opposite corners of the cabin, yet shared the same abyss inside their souls. That silence was no longer heavy. It had become a thread thin, invisible, that drew two broken hearts closer together. Outside, the rain still poured against the cabin walls. But inside, for the first time in many years, two people no longer felt entirely alone. Thank you for being here. If this story brought back old memories, dusty afternoons, the sound of hooves echoing deep in your heart, then subscribe to my channel, so that each day we can sit together again. And I will tell you another story from the Wild West. Winter was slowly retreating from the mountains, but the nights remained cold as steel. Even with the doors shut tight, the wooden cabin shuddered with each gust of wind. Jonas sat in front of the fireplace, his calloused hands carving a rough spoon out of a piece of wood. His eyes, however, were not truly focused on the task. They kept drifting toward the woman sitting in the far corner. Tayanita, wrapped in a worn wool blanket, was patiently stitching up a torn shirt with an old thread. The night was quiet. Only the crackling of the fire filled the space. Then, without a word, Jonas stood up and reached for the thickest coat hanging by the door. He walked over and gently draped it across Tayanita's broad shoulders. She flinched, her dark eyes locking onto his alert, and a little confused. Jonas spoke softly, his voice rough but warm. "It is cold." Tayanita did not reply, but her hand, still holding the needle, trembled slightly as if holding back something she could not name. From that moment on, The small gestures began to grow. At meals, Jonas always pushed the meat toward her side of the plate. When she tried to carry water from the well, Jonas followed silently behind, keeping hold of the rope to steady the bucket. No words were exchanged, but those quiet acts of care slowly began to wear down the thorns around their hearts. One evening, after a long day repairing the fence, they sat together on the porch. The highland wind blew past, carrying the scent of dry grass and cooking smoke. Jonas poured her half a glass of corn whiskey and offered it. Tianita hesitated, then took it and sipped. The sting of the liquor made her full lips tremble slightly. Their eyes met longer than usual. In the glow of the firewood, Jonas saw something in her gaze that was no longer just fear or pride. There was another light now. Faint, but impossible to look away from. Without saying a word, he reached out and touched her rough hand. Calluses met calluses. Tianita did not pull away. In that moment, it felt like the final thread had snapped free. Jonas leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, hesitant at first, then firmer, as if trying to make up for all the lonely years and all that had been lost. Tianita trembled. Her strong shoulders leaned into him, and in that embrace, two broken souls finally found something to hold on to. That night, the cabin did not echo only with wind and fire. It held the sound of breath shared between two people who had dared to step out of the dark and into the light. Rumors spread like wildfire across the dry prairie. In town, whispers stirred about an Apache woman cast out now hiding at Jonas Reed's ranch. Some laughed. Others began calculating how much she might fetch if handed over to the nearest trafficking post. And among them, one bounty hunter quietly accepted the job. His name was Clay Murdoch, tall and lean, with skin weathered like rusted iron and eyes sharp as a blade. He had made his living tracking down the broken and the damned. Now, he had set his sights on this woman, determined to collect a handsome reward. One late afternoon, with red sunlight spilling across the open plains, Jonas was leading a horse into the stable when he heard hoofbeats in the distance. The clink of metal on saddle rang out like a funeral bell. Jonas slowly released the reins and rested a hand on the rifle at his side. Tianita stepped onto the porch, her sun-darkened face held high, black eyes blazing in the fading light. She had lived a life under scorn, but this time, she knew real danger had come calling. Clay Murdoch reined in his horse at the wooden gate. His voice was dry and coarse. "I heard you are keeping an Apache woman. That woman is worth something. Hand her over, and I will walk away." Jonas stood tall, his shoulders heavy like the mountain at his back. He answered flatly, "She is not a thing to be traded." Clay smirked, waving a crumpled warrant in the wind. "Then you are standing against the law, and I like fools like you stubborn to the end." The wind swept through the tall grass, lifting dust across the open yard. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. Jonas took a quiet step back, giving Tianita a slight nod, as if to tell her to go inside. But she did not move. She gripped the small axe in her hand, her eyes burning like fire. The sky turned to deep indigo. Darkness was falling, and with it, a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. Jonas knew well. Blood would be spilled. He turned to Tianita, his voice low but firm. "No matter what happens, I will not let him take you." And out front, Clay Murdoch tightened his grip on the gun at his hip, his eyes like a predator ready to strike. A deadly clash was drawing near. Jonas stood firm at the cabin door, his grip tight on the Winchester rifle, while inside, Tianita trembled. The nightmare she had long feared had become real. 3 bounty hunters had tracked them down, torches in hand, eyes glowing with menace. "Hand over the Apache woman, old rancher, and you might live." The voice of the leader was thick and gravelly, as if he already counted himself the victor. Jonas spat on the ground, raising his rifle level with his eyes. "Take one more step, and one of you will fall." The air was thick and charged. One pull of the trigger, and blood would splash across the cabin porch. But just as the tension reached its peak, a low horn blew from the edge of the valley. Then shadows emerged, riders cloaked in animal hides, spears glinting in the firelight, Apache warriors. The bounty hunters spun around in shock, but before they could react, arrows sliced through the air, pinning their torches to the ground and snuffing out the flames. The prairie was swallowed in darkness, save for the pounding of hooves closing in all around. A tall Apache elder rode forward, his voice echoing clear and strong. "You hunt the weak, sell their bodies like beasts. This sin will not go unpunished by the tribe." The bounty hunters, now pale and trembling, were struck down and bound by the warriors. The scene felt like judgment passed by the land itself, undeniable, final. Tyanita stepped out of the cabin, her face lit by the flickering fire. The very warriors who once turned their backs on her now bowed their heads. The elder's voice turned rough, heavy with meaning. "We were wrong to cast you aside. You are of our blood. From this day on, if you choose to stay with this man, that will be your choice. But know this, we have come to make amends." Tears welled in Tyanita's eyes. She turned to Jonas, and her strong hand reached for his hand, the one that had dared to stand against the world for her. Jonas gave a quiet nod, a weight lifting from his heart. He was no longer alone in this fight, and more importantly, Tyanita was no longer a castaway. She had been claimed by love, by choice, and by her people. That night, under a sky full of stars, no blood had to be shed, but the hearts of two people and an entire tribe were mended through choice, through love, and through forgiveness. The next morning, sunlight stretched across the prairie, still heavy with the mist of night. Jonas's small wooden cabin, once a symbol of solitude, now glowed with life, the sound of horses neighing and the voices of Apache men and women filling the air outside. The tribe had stayed through the night, both as protectors and as a sign of goodwill. Jonas sat on the porch steps, his Winchester resting by his side, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. Tyanita stepped outside, her sun-darkened face lit by something he had never seen before, peace. She quietly sat down beside him, her strong but gentle hand resting on his. The elder approached and bowed his head to them both. "We owe you, Jonas, and we owe Tyanita. The tribe was blind. We let our daughter suffer, scorned and abandoned. But you have shown that compassion is stronger than fear. From this day forward, the doors of our tribe will always be open to you." Jonas answered with a quiet nod. He had no need for grand words. What mattered was that Tyanita was no longer cast out, and he was no longer alone. As the tribe departed, Tyanita stood watching for a long while, then turned to Jonas and whispered, I think I am with child." Jonas froze. His hand reached for her belly, trembling, as if not daring to believe the words he had just heard. A smile spread across his face, a face once carved by hardship and loss. In his eyes now shone a glimmer of hope, a light stronger than all the years of darkness behind them. In the days that followed, they began to rebuild the cabin together. Jonas added a small room off the side of the house, sometimes pausing to imagine the sound of little feet running across the wooden porch. Tyanita sat by the window, sewing small pieces of cloth into tiny shirts, her eyes filled with quiet joy. As the evening sun painted the prairie in fiery red, Jonas sat on the porch, his arm wrapped around Tyanita's shoulders. Her hand rested gently over her belly, where a new life was beginning to grow. The wind carried the scent of dry grass, wood smoke, and the quiet promise of a better tomorrow. Jonas spoke softly, his voice low and warm. "Maybe God let us lose our way, just so we could find each other." Tyanita leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. In that moment, they both knew, though the world outside remained harsh, they had a home, a family, and a faith that nothing could shake. Out on the prairie, where once there was only dust and loneliness, a new story had taken root, one of love, forgiveness, and a family born from pain. Dear friends, in the desert of life, love is the rare drop of water that nourishes the soul. It does not erase every scar, but it makes us strong enough to keep walking. A man can survive by fire and steel, but he only truly lives when he finds a hand to hold and a home to return to. In the end, I wish you a life full of joy and happiness. I love you, my dear audience of Wild West storytelling. Tell me what you thought about this story. Leave a comment below. Type the number 1 if you enjoyed it. And do not forget to subscribe for more thrilling stories from the Wild West. Three figures staggered forward from the sun-scorched hillside. They were 3 Apache women. Their clothes were torn, their bare feet bloodied and dusty. The one in front, Takina, was tall and broad-shouldered, her muscular arms streaked with cuts. Her eyes were deep and dark, filled with both exhaustion and fire. Close behind her came Nieli, one shoulder streaked with blood, her hand still gripping a broken spear. Tala, the youngest, was trembling, her face smudged with soot, her wide eyes full of terror. Reed stood silently, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of the pistol at his hip. His years in the army came flooding back. He had seen this before, women and children fleeing from gunfire and flames. But this time, they were not bowing or begging. They stood tall, like three broken columns of stone that refused to fall. Takina spoke, her voice rough and hoarse. "Please, let us stay with you. Our tribe was slaughtered. The men have fallen. The women and children were herded away. We escaped, and have nowhere else to go." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows of their bodies onto the dry, cracked ground. Reed noticed Tala's eyes locked onto the well behind him. Thirst gnawed at her even more than her wounds. In that moment, Reed had to choose. Shut the door as he had for the past 3 years, or open the gate and let 3 strangers walk into his life. At last, he let go of his gun and gently pushed the wooden gate open. "There's water over there. Tonight, you'll sleep in the barn." Takina nodded. The 3 stepped inside, their shadows filling the small yard, and Reed knew. His quiet days had just come to an end. On the first night, the sound of wind whistling through the cracks of the barn door kept Reed tossing and turning. He kept his pistol within reach, eyes half open through the night, just as he had done since his days in the military. But this time, the yard outside was no longer empty. There were now 3 figures sleeping on a bed of dry hay. The next morning, as he stepped outside, Reed saw that Takina had been up for a while. She was kneeling by the well, her swollen hands hauling up buckets of water and pouring them into a wooden barrel. Nieli, her wounded shoulder wrapped with a torn piece of cloth, was splitting firewood with clumsy but determined swings of the axe. Tala, shivering slightly, was sweeping the yard with a broken-handled broom. Reed watched silently. He had not told them to do anything, but something in their survival instincts seemed to tell them. If they wanted to stay, they had to prove it through action. He left a few pieces of hard bread on the porch table, saying nothing. When he came back, he saw Tala sneaking up to it, gently breaking off a small piece and hesitantly bringing it to her mouth. The way she bit into it so slowly, as if afraid the food would vanish, made Reed clench his calloused hands. That entire day, Reed went about his usual chores, checking the fence, taking the horses to pasture. But his eyes kept drifting back toward the barn. Takina had taken over the wood chopping from Nieli, each swing of the axe landing with solid, steady rhythm. Nieli tried to keep smiling, masking the pain in her shoulder. Tala sat quietly, stitching old shirts with a broken needle. By the time the sun began to dip westward, Reed saw a neat stack of firewood, a clean yard, and a full well. No words had been exchanged, but he understood the message they were sending. "We are not asking for charity. We are working for our place." That evening, Reed brought over a pot of stewed beans and placed it near the fire they had lit. The 3 women looked up, eyes meeting. Takina gave a small nod, for the first time. There was no thank you, but to Reed, that gesture spoke louder than 1,000 words. In the flickering firelight, he watched them eat in silence, their weathered faces etched with scars. His cabin remained cold, but the yard outside had found a faint warmth, the kind Reed thought he had lost forever. On the 3rd day, when Reed stepped outside, he saw Takina pulling a collapsed section of fence back into place. Her face was tense, muscles rippling under layers of sun-baked dust. Nieli stood beside her, one hand steadying a wooden post while the other held back the pain in her shoulder. Tala crouched low, struggling to tie a frayed rope around the base of a stake. Reed did not tell them to stop, nor did he offer any comment. But for the first time, he stepped forward, picked up the hammer, and drove in the final nails with firm, deliberate strikes. 3 pairs of eyes turned to him in mild surprise. Then Takina bowed her head and quietly returned to her work as if accepting his silent approval. At noon, the group sat by the porch. Reed set a pot of stewed beans on the wooden table, its aroma cutting through the smell of sweat and dust. Tala cautiously handed a spoon to Nieli, and for the first time, offered a small smile like a flicker of flame catching hold. Nieli raised an eyebrow and smiled back, her raspy laugh breaking into the stillness of the yard. Reed paused for a moment. It had been a long time since this house had heard a woman's laughter. As the afternoon waned, they walked out together to bring the cattle back from the field. The golden sunlight bathed the grasslands, clouds of dust rising with each step. Tala jogged behind a calf, stumbling but determined. When the animal gave her a playful nudge, she yelped, then burst into giggles as it simply licked her hand. The sound stopped both Reed and the other women in their tracks. Tala's innocent laughter in the midst of loss and bloodshed seemed to lift some of the weight from the air. That night, the four of them sat around the fire inside the cabin. Takina mended a torn shirt. Nieli sharpened a broken-bladed knife. Tala arranged pieces of wood by the hearth. Reed quietly added more logs to the flames. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting 4 overlapping shadows on the wooden wall. Shadows that looked, for a moment, like a family gathered close. Reed leaned back in his chair, listening to the gentle crackle of the fire, and a strange thought flickered through his mind. Maybe, after all these years of silence and ashes, this house had finally found warmth again. That night, the wind howled through the mountain pass, carrying with it an unusual chill from the lower plains. The fire in the cabin burned bright red, casting sharp shadows across each face. Reed sat at the head of the table, holding a cup of cold coffee. The 3 Apache women sat across from him, their silhouettes stretched long against the wooden wall. The room was silent, until Takina spoke. Her voice was hoarse and slow, as if every word had to be pulled from somewhere deep in her flesh and blood. We have no home to return to. Our tribe was ambushed before the sun even rose. The sound of hooves, gunfire. We did not even have time to understand what was happening. Nieli clenched her fist, her wounded shoulder flaring with pain. Tala lowered her head, both hands trembling. Takina went on, her eyes fixed on the fire. The men were shot immediately. Women and children were herded onto horses like livestock. We were separated from them. I do not know if they are even alive now. Reed set his cup down, the soft tap breaking the stillness. In his mind, old memories rose. Back when he was still in the army, he had once witnessed a cavalry raid on an Apache village. Flames rising, screams and crying echoing. He had walked away, he could not bear it, but the image had haunted him for 3 long years. Now, sitting before him were the living ghosts of a tragedy just like that one. Reed looked up, locking eyes with Takina. In that moment, there was no hostility, only a shared pain. He knew that if he turned away again, it would be no different than having taken part in those massacres himself. Nieli suddenly stood, her voice cracked with grief. We are not asking for pity. We just want a place where no one else gets to decide what happens to us. Reed was silent for a long time, then slowly nodded. No one here has the right to drive you out anymore. The 3 women froze. Tala looked up, her eyes wet but shining. Takina folded the cloth she had been stitching and let out a breath for the first time, as if a part of her burden had been lifted. That night, the 4 of them sat long by the fire. No more words were needed, but in every glance, every quiet nod, the foundation of trust began to take root. I am grateful to have you here. If this story reminded you of the old days' dusty afternoons, the sound of hooves echoing in your chest, then subscribe to my channel, so that every day we can sit together once more, and I can tell you another tale from the West. The next morning, just as the sun was rising, Reed stepped into the yard and saw Takina already at the fence, splitting new wooden posts with an axe. Each strike landed firm and solid, her broad shoulders rippling with muscle. Beside her, Nieli knelt down, pulling a rope tight around a post. Her wounded shoulder still ached, but she gritted her teeth and said nothing. Tala, her messy hair covering half her face, was carefully tying small bundles of firewood. Reed watched for a while, then walked over and reached out to adjust the knot Tala was tying. She flinched at first, but when she saw the calm, non-judgmental look in his eyes, she nodded and continued, her hands growing steadier with each loop. By midday, Reed led the horses out to the field. This time, Takina came along. They did not talk much, just the occasional exchange about the herd, about the direction of the wind. But it was that quiet that said the most. They did not need words. Presence alone was enough. That afternoon, Nieli offered to take the night watch. I am still strong, she said, her eyes steady and unyielding. Reed nodded, no protest. That night, he saw her sitting upright on the porch, spear in hand, eyes wide open. The sight struck him. These were not just people in need of his protection. They were also protecting him. Day by day, the distance between them began to fade. Tala laughed more, running around the barn, practicing commands Reed had taught her. Nieli started calling him by his name, her voice still raspy but no longer cold. Takina spoke the least, But sometimes, her eyes quietly followed Reed as he stoked the fire, or drove in a stake not with suspicion, but as if weighing the beginnings of trust. One evening, as the four of them sat around the fire, Nieli burst out laughing when Tala clumsily knocked over the pot of beans. The laughter echoed through the small cabin and spilled into Reed as well. He could not remember the last time he had laughed that hard. In that moment, he realized. The cabin, once just an empty shell of wood, had begun to feel like a home. And perhaps, for the first time in many years, Reed Carver was no longer just a survivor but a part of something new. A part of a family. That afternoon, the harsh sunlight cast long shadows across the newly built fence. Reed was driving in the final stake when the old dog in the yard began to growl. The sound of hooves rolled in from the distance, low and thunderous. 4 riders came straight toward the gate. Their coats were dusty, pistols swinging at their hips. At the front rode a tall man with a thick, ragged beard and eyes squinting like knives. He spat on the ground, then spoke with a voice rough from tobacco. "Heard some Apache bitches escaped up here. I just came to collect what's mine." Reed stepped directly in front of the gate, his hand resting lightly on the grip of his pistol. Behind him, Takina and Nieli had appeared silently, their eyes dark with steel. Tala trembled in the shadow of the doorway. "There's only me here," Reed said, his voice flat and cold. "And the cattle. If you saw anyone else, must have been your eyes playing tricks." The leader sneered. "Old man, don't be stupid. We can smell the fear coming off this yard. Hand them over, and maybe I leave your barn standing." Tension stretched across the air. Only the wind moved, whipping dust around the gate. Reed took a single step forward, his gaze sharp as steel. "They are my family. Cross this gate, and you do not come back." The riders shifted uneasily. One of the younger ones reached for his gun, but the leader raised a hand to stop him. His glare locked onto Reed, then slid to Takina, who stood tall like a warrior, muscles tensed, eyes burning. "You ain't won yet," he growled. "I'll be back, and when I do, this place'll burn to the ground." With that, he pulled the reins. The 4 horsemen turned and rode off, dust rising in a thick cloud behind them, leaving behind the stench of gunpowder and a threat that lingered in the wind. Reed let his hand fall from the pistol, but his eyes stayed fixed on the ridge until the riders vanished over the hill. Takina stepped up beside him, her voice low and hoarse. "He will come back. With more." Reed nodded, his hand clenched white at the knuckles. "Then we will stand. Together." The 3 women looked at him, no word spoken. But in their eyes, for the first time, was something beyond wariness, the belief that this time, they would not have to run again. Moments after the riders disappeared, Reed stood in silence, his eyes resting on the newly built fence. Then he turned to the 3 women. He did not say much, just nodded once. "We need to prepare. They will be back, and in greater numbers." From that moment on, the little ranch became a makeshift fortress. Takina took the lead in organizing the defenses. She had once been a warrior of her tribe and knew how to set traps, build barricades. Her strong hands drove sharpened wooden stakes into the ground along the fence line, her eyes focused and unwavering like steel. Nieli worked alongside Reed, dragging sacks of corn into the barn to build a makeshift wall, the second line of defense in case the gate was breached. Tala, the youngest, took charge of firewood and ammunition, carefully packing black powder into old cartridges under the glow of the oil lamp. At night, Reed taught them how to use the Winchester rifle. Nieli went first. Her shot hit the trunk of a tree 30 feet away. She pressed her lips together, her eyes glowing. Takina, no stranger to firearms, still listened closely, allowing Reed to guide her hands, a silent nod to his role as their leader. Tala trembled as she lifted the rifle. When the shot rang out, she burst into tears, then quickly wiped them away and kept practicing. As darkness fell, they sat around the fire in the cabin. The flickering flame cast a red glow on their faces, worn from the day, yet lit with something else, determination. Reed looked at each of them, his voice low but firm. "We might die, but if they come, they will learn the cost of stepping onto this land." Takina nodded, her dark eyes gleaming. "Better to die standing than live on our knees." Nieli gripped the handle of her knife, giving a faint, dry smile. Tala whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "This time, we do not run." Outside, the night wind howled through the cracks in the door, carrying with it a chill and the scent of dust. But inside, the fire blazed steadily, warming more than just their bodies. It warmed the fragile trust that had just begun to bloom. Reed knew he was no longer alone. The 3 Apache women beside him were no longer just refugees. They were comrades. They were family. And when dawn came, if the enemy returned, the 4 of them would stand shoulder to shoulder against the world. Before the sun could rise, a sharp bark from the old dog shattered the stillness of the night. Reed sprang up, his hand already gripping the Colt. Outside, the horizon was still dark, but the sound of galloping hooves thundered from the valley like rolling storm clouds. "They're here," Reed said quietly, his voice calm and cold. Takina, Nieli, and Tala were already waiting. The 3 Apache women stood tall and strong, and in the faint light, they looked like bronze statues guarding sacred ground. Takina clutched the rifle Reed had given her. Nieli held a knife in one hand, a pistol in the other. Tala gripped the short carbine tightly, her eyes wide, but no longer filled with fear. The hooves grew louder. Then a red haze of dust filled the sky. More than 20 riders emerged, led by Reich, his face pale as ash, his cruel eyes flashing in the dark. He shouted, his voice shrill, slicing through the rumble of horses. "Reed Callahan, hand over the women, and I'll let you live. If not, you die here with them." Reed stepped forward, standing just before the fence, Winchester slung over his shoulder. He shouted back, his voice ringing clear, "Set foot past this fence, and you won't be going back." A deadly silence followed. Then Reich raised his hand. The riders charged. Swords, gunshots, hooves, all roared into one storm. The first shot rang from Reed's Winchester. One rider fell hard, rolling in the dust. Takina fired next, her bullet slamming into another man's shoulder. Nieli sprang from the shadows at the fence, slashing at a horse's reins, sending both beast and rider into chaos. Tala's hands trembled, but she pulled the trigger, her shot hitting the dirt just inches from Reich, making him jolt and look back in alarm. Gunfire exploded. Smoke thickened around the ranch. Horses screamed. Men shouted, "Chaos regnet." Reed reloaded so quickly his calloused hands barely paused. Each shot dropped another enemy. Takina, though still limping, stood firm, the rifle an extension of her will. Nieli charged into close combat, her knife flashing beneath the first light of dawn. Tala, the smallest, screamed as she fired. "No one takes us again." As the sun crept above the horizon and the dust swirled into a red mist, the battle neared its end. Bodies lay scattered across the earth. The rest fled in panic. Reich, wounded in the shoulder, struggled to retreat, spitting curses as he rode away. Reed lowered his rifle. Sweat and dust coated his weathered face. He turned to the 3 Apache women. They stood breathing hard, clothes torn and ragged, but eyes burning with the fire of survival. No one smiled. They simply looked at each other, silent. But in that silence, something was certain. From this day on, they were no longer strangers. They had fought as a family, and this land, through blood and gunpowder, had become their shared home. My friends, under the harsh skies of the Wild West, there are only 2 things left to hold on to: love and justice. True strength is not found in the fastest draw, but in the one who opens their door to the weak, who dares to stand when darkness surrounds. When we choose love, we find ourselves. When we defend justice, we offer hope for the world to carry on. Thank you, my dear friends, the loyal audience of Wild West storytelling. From the bottom of my heart, I wish you peace and happiness, wherever you are. I love you. Tell me what you felt about this story. Leave a comment down below. Type "Ana" if you enjoyed it. And do not forget to subscribe for more thrilling stories from the Wild West. Pine Creek Market, 1850. Amid the bustling crowd, a striking figure emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, unlike anyone else around. Nara, an Apache woman built like a warrior, her frame solid and proud, but in her deep black eyes lingered a quiet sorrow. She wanted just one simple thing: a home and a man to stand beside her, so she would not have to wander like someone the world had left behind. She clutched a few coins tightly in her hand and stepped toward the bread stand. The vendor glanced at her with thinly veiled disdain. but handed her a stale loaf all the same. As she turned to walk away, a pack of children suddenly darted after her, hurling pebbles at her back, shouting, "Monster! Giant woman, no man will ever marry her." Their laughter rippled through the market. A few adults folded their arms and watched. Some even chimed in with smug remarks. Nara lowered her head, clutching the loaf to her chest. The stones stung her skin, but it was the words, sharp as knives, that cut deepest. A drunken man staggered forward, trying to shove her to the ground, but before he could lay a hand on her, another hand grabbed him by the collar and yanked him backward. Jonas Reed, a middle-aged rancher, skin weathered by sun and wind, his gray eyes cold and steady. He stepped between Nara and the drunk, voice low and firm. "If you touch her again, you will pay." The market fell silent. Jonas released the man, who stumbled backward, then turned and calmly placed a few more coins on the counter, paying for Nara's bread. He picked the loaf up from the ground and handed it to her, his expression calm, unwavering. "Come on," he said. "I've got an empty seat at my ranch for dinner." A simple invitation. But for Nara, it was a lifeline offered in the middle of a crowd full of ridicule. Nara followed silently behind Jonas as they left the market. The mocking laughter still echoed behind her. But the farther they walked, the steadier her heartbeat became. Along the red dirt road, the rancher's silhouette led the way, his coat slung loose over one shoulder, his stride firm and unfaltering. She felt oddly safe, and yet a quiet doubt stirred inside her. She had been deceived too many times. Men looked at her as a joke, or worse, as a strange commodity to be traded. So why had this man stepped in to help? When they reached the ranch, Jonas opened the creaky wooden door. Inside was simple: a square table, a few worn chairs, a cold fireplace. He said little, only motioned toward a small room at the end of the hall. "This room's empty. There's a lock on the door. Stay if you want, leave if you don't." Nara froze. A room? With a lock? No one had ever offered her that. She stole a glance at Jonas's weathered face. No smirk, no pity. Just calm, as if giving her a place to stay was nothing unusual. In the first few days, Nara barely left the room. She sat close to the door, listening to his footsteps outside, the sound of him splitting wood, leading horses into the barn. When hunger finally pushed her out, she found bread and a pot of beans waiting on the table. Jonas had stepped outside, giving her space. She didn't know whether to believe it or run. The longing for a home tugged at her chest, but so did the fear of being hurt again, like a shadow that never left. One afternoon, Jonas returned after a long day, shirt soaked in sweat. He found Nara kneeling by the horse pen, carefully clearing the straw. Her broad hands moved with quiet purpose, shielding old scars left by lashes. He said nothing for a while, just watched, then spoke in a calm, steady tone. "They need someone to care for them. If you want, this can be your job." Nara looked up and met his gaze. For the first time, she saw no disgust, only quiet respect. That night, she sat by the small window in her room, listening to the wind whistle across the open plain. Her chest still trembled, but in her eyes, a flicker of hope had begun to glow. Maybe, just maybe this time, she could stay. At dawn, the prairie glowed under soft orange light. Jonas had been up early, hammering a broken fence post near the cattle pen. Nara stepped out from the small room, her long hair tousled, her steps slow and cautious in the unfamiliar space. She paused on the threshold, watching the man work, his calloused hands steady around the hammer. Jonas looked up and saw her. He gave a simple nod, then turned back to the task, no urging, no judgment in his eyes. And it was that calm indifference that somehow made Nara feel a little less heavy. After a quiet moment, she walked over, bent down, and lifted one of the heavy posts with both strong arms. Jonas blinked in mild surprise but said nothing, simply moved aside to give her space. They worked side by side, his hammer striking in rhythm, her breathing falling into step with the morning wind. By noon, both their shirts were soaked through with sweat. Jonas hung up the hammer and went inside to stoke the fire. When Nara followed, the table was already set with cornbread and a hot pot of stewed beans. Jonas pulled out a chair and said simply, "Sit." At first, the meal was wrapped in silence. Nara broke the bread quietly, her eyes lowered, still keeping her distance. Jonas ate slowly, occasionally glancing over as if making sure she was comfortable. Then, Unexpectedly, he spoke. "Old cow of mine, smarter than any dog I've ever had, left the gate open yesterday, and she led the whole herd into my corn patch. Ate every last ear." His tone was dry, but his eyes held a flicker of humor. Nara looked up, and for the first time in days, the corner of her mouth curved. A faint, rare smile. That small moment lifted the weight in the room. In the days that followed, they began to find a rhythm. Nara gathered dry grass in the fields. Jonas chopped firewood. In the afternoons, they led the horses to the stream together. Not many words passed between them, but the quiet understanding grew, as natural as if it had always been there. One evening, while Jonas stacked the last of the firewood by the porch, Nara brought out an old chair she had repaired. She set it down beside him and spoke softly. "You've done enough today. Time to sit." Jonas looked at the chair, then at her, his eyes quiet, but warm. He sat, exhaling deeply. Nara stood beside him, gazing up at the night sky, and in her heart, something stirred. Maybe, just maybe, this place was becoming the home she had once dreamed of. A week later, Jonas needed new tools for the ranch. Nara insisted on coming along. She wanted to choose some fabric herself to patch her worn dress. They rode into Pine Creek, a town of red dirt roads, saloons, blacksmiths, and general stores packed close together. The moment Nara stepped down from the horse, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations halted. Glances were exchanged. Smirks and whispers spread like fire on dry grass. The same children who once threw stones now clustered in corners, pointing. "Look, it's the giant monster. Who'd ever marry that thing?" A few men leaning outside the saloon burst into laughter. One of them even whistled mockingly. Nara clenched her fists, her face flushing with heat. The old shame surged up, tightening her chest. She wanted to turn and leave, but Jonas stepped forward, calm and unaffected. He handed her a woven basket, his voice steady and low. "Go in. Pick what you need. I'll be right here." Nara hesitated, then slowly walked into the store. At that moment, a drunken man stumbled out of the saloon, slurring loudly. "Hey, you filthy savage. Who'd take in something your size? Whole damn town's laughing at you." Laughter followed sharp, cutting. Nara bowed her head, tears stinging at the corners of her eyes. But before they could fall, Jonas stepped in front of her. He grabbed the drunk by the collar, his gray eyes cold as steel. "Listen carefully. She's my wife." Silence fell over the entire street. Laughter died in an instant. Only the wind whistled under the saloon's awning. Jonas released the man, who crumpled into the dirt. Then, without a word, he turned back, lifted the basket into Nara's hands, as if nothing needed explaining. Nara stood frozen. Those words echoed in her chest, wiping away years of shame. "My wife." Her breath caught. Tears welled, but this time, not from pain. This time, they came from something far deeper. She had been defended, openly claimed not as an object, not out of pity, but as a woman, as a wife. That evening, as they rode back toward the ranch, Nara sat behind Jonas, arms wrapped tightly around his waist. The wind whipped across the prairie, but in her heart, all she felt was warmth. For the first time, she felt she truly belonged, rooted beside someone who would never let her stand alone in this wide, wild world. Thank you for being here with me. If this story brought back memories of dusty evenings and hoofbeats echoing in your soul, subscribe to my channel, so each day we can sit down again, and I'll tell you another tale from the Wild West. News at the market spread like wildfire. In just a few days, all of Pine Creek was talking. The lonely rancher Jonas Reed had publicly called a giant Apache woman his wife. For some, it was nothing more than sharp laughter and salacious tales in the saloon. But for others, it stoked greed and cruelty. One night, after the moon had slipped behind the mountains, Nara was giving water to the horses when she heard strange footsteps beyond the fence. Her warrior instinct snapped awake, strong arms gripping the handle of a hoe as if it were a weapon. A moment later, dogs barked. Jonas came out of the house, Winchester in hand. Shadows moved through tall grass, then 3 men appeared, faces masked, revolvers swinging at their hips. "We heard you keep a monster in your house," one sneered. "Sell her to us, maybe someone at the border will pay good money." "Human traffickers. They'll pay more for something unusual." Jonas raised his Winchester, his eyes hard and cold. "Leave this land. Right now." The wind howled across the porch. One of the men, reckless, drew his pistol. Before he could aim properly, Elias fired. No, Jonas fired a shot that buried itself in the earth at the man's feet. At the same time, Nara surged forward like a storm, swinging the hoe into a man's face, sending him sprawling. Chow's exploded. Though one of her arms still throbbed with pain, Nara's size and strength disoriented the attackers. Jonas stood behind her, the Winchester barking shot after shot, forcing them back into the night. At last, the three masked figures disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind smoke, spent cartridges, and heavy breathing. But on Nara's arm was a deep gash, blood blooming red in the glow of the lantern. Jonas hurried her inside. His hand trembled slightly as he bound the wound, parched lips and hardened face, showing something rarely seen. Fear. "I shouldn't have let you go out alone," he muttered. Nara looked at him, her eyes blazing with resolve. "I want to help keep this home. With you." In that moment, no words were needed. In the dead of night, with blood, sweat, and pistol smoke, they became true allies, not just to repel enemies, but to guard something sacred, a place they could call home. In the days after the attack, the ranch still carried the smell of gunpowder. Jonas raised new fences, set traps around the perimeter, and Nara, despite her wounded arm, insisted on helping. Amid bruises and blood-tinted hands, her resilience only made Jonas respect her more deeply. One morning, sunlight streamed across the prairie. Jonas stood on the porch, Winchester slung over his shoulder. He watched Nara leading the horse into the corral, her broad shoulders unwavering, the way a warrior would stand. Then he spoke, his voice low but sure, something he had thought over long ago. "You can't live forever under Pine Creek's gossip. I want them to know for good that you're more than just passing through. You are my wife." Not a froze, wydayed. He had once said those words in the market to defend her, but this time, it was different. It was not just protection, but a promise held in the open, in the light. That afternoon, they rode into town to the little church in Pine Creek. Word had spread fast. As they crossed the wooden threshold, many townsfolk whispering outside paused. Some mocked. Others shook their heads in disbelief. But inside, the old preacher who had known Jonas for years just nodded. He opened his Bible, his voice rich and warm. Nara wore the plain dress she had mended herself, sewn from scraps of cheap fabric. Her thick black hair was tied back, revealing her sun-tanned face glowing with happiness. The wounds on her arm were still bruised. She placed her bandaged hand into Jonas's rough, calloused one. The preacher spoke the blessing, light streaming through dusty-stained glass, falling across them. In that moment, Nara heard her heart beating clearly. She heard the whisper of her long-held wish. A home. A man who would not leave her. And now, that wish was real. Then the preacher asked, "Do you take this woman to be your wife, to live with her through all that life brings, until the end of your days?" Jonas looked into Nara's eyes, voice firm. "I do." Nara, voice thick with feeling, answered, "I do." Outside, the whispers persisted, but inside that little church, two people had found peace. No feast, no wedding flower decorations, just promises before God, and eyes full of love. From that day on, Nara was no longer the giant woman who was laughed at. She was Jonas Reed's wife, the woman of Pine Creek Ranch, and in her heart, a home had truly begun. That summer, the fields around Pine Creek were golden with wild grain. Nara often stood on the porch, hand pressed to her belly, feeling new life growing every day. Word that she was expecting spread fast through town, louder than ever before. Some mocked. Wonder how big that baby's gonna be. But Jonas didn't care about their taunts. All he knew was that he was going to be a father again. Nara faced hard days of morning sickness. Night after night, she twisted in restless discomfort. Jonas sat beside her, in the old chair, reading passages from the Bible in his low, even voice, trying to ease her exhaustion. In those times, Nara looked at him with gratitude, knowing how broken his heart had been when he lost his family, believing he would have no chance at hope again. Now, together, they had found meaning in a home. 1 month later, with her belly swollen, she still insisted on helping with the ranch. Jonas, worried, said, Rest, Em. Let me handle the hard work. Nara gently smiled and pressed her hand over her belly. The baby will want to see his mother strong. One afternoon, the labor pains came suddenly. The wind rattled across the porch roof. The sky darkened as if testing both of them. Jonas rushed to support her into the cabin, sweat beading on his forehead. He had faced gunfire before, but never had he felt his bones tremble as he did now. After hours in pain and labor, the sound of a newborn's cry echoed through the small cabin. A baby girl, red and small, came into the world. Tiny hands clenched around Jonas's calloused finger. He held his daughter, tears running down his sun-browned face. For the first time since losing his family, he cried not from sorrow, but from joy. Nara, exhausted but radiant, whispered, "Her name is Ruth. Now I have a home." Jonas sat beside the bed, cradling both of them. In that moment, he understood that every wound, every lonely night of the past, had been healed by the clear cry of this child. Outside, the sunset stained the prairie red. Pine Creek Ranch was no longer the lonely place of a solitary rancher. It was the home of a family at last. Autumn spread its golden glow across the Arizona prairie. The air smelled of freshly cut hay, and migrating birds flew across a sky so clear it seemed endless. On the wooden porch of Pine Creek Ranch, Jonas sat in his old rocking chair, his gray eyes quietly watching two figures in the yard. Nara, her long black hair tied back, stood like a bronze statue, steady and strong. She carried little Ruth in her arms, walking slowly, softly singing an Apache lullaby. Ruth gripped the hem of her mother's dress, her round eyes taking in the vast world. Occasionally, Nara paused, bending low so Ruth could touch the old dog lying drowsily in the sunday. Jonas smiled. Over the years, his life had known only silence and loss. Now, Ruth's giggles, the warmth of Nara's song, and the lively beat of a home had rekindled a fire in his heart. Work in the fields no longer felt as heavy as before. Even with a child to care for, Nara stayed strong bundling hay, leading the horses into pastures. Jonas often urged her to rest, but Nara only laughed. "A mother is not weak. My daughter will learn what it means to stand tall for me." At twilight, the three of them gathered around the wooden table. Ruth perched in her father's lap, tiny hand playing with the salt-to-pepper whiskers on his chin. Nara sat beside them, eyes deep yet shining with peace. The meal was simple cornbread, stewed beans but warm in every way. In quiet moments, Jonas found his mind wandering back to that first day in Pine Creek's market. The image of a tall, lonely woman clutching her loaf of bread, getting stoned at by the crowd. If he had turned his back that day like so many others, this home would never exist now. One evening, after Ruth slept soundly, Nara leaned against Jonas and whispered, "I thought I would die in loneliness, that no one would ever want to touch my life. But now," she didn't finish, but she squeezed his hand tightly. "I have you. I have Ruth. I have this home." Jonas bent and kissed the roughened hand of his wife. His voice hushed, thick with emotion. "And I finally have a family again." Outside, the prairie wind rustled in lullaby-like whispers. Jonas Reed's little cabin was no longer a sign of solitude. It was a home with family's light dancing warmly inside, where a woman once abandoned and a man once broken found each other, and together wrote a new life. My dear friends, in the dusty West, with guns and scornful glances, there's one fire that never goes out. Love and a family home. Not grand, just simple, but a man who holds your hand. A woman who dares to give her heart, and the laughter of a child in that small house. That is true happiness, the thing every human, no matter how strong, quietly yearns for. It is a great honor to have shared this journey with you, my dear listeners of Wild West storytelling. I hope always you find joy and peace. Wherever you are, I love all of you. Let me know what you thought of this story. Leave your comment right below. Type 1 if you enjoyed this tale. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling stories from the Wild West. A crescent moon hung low over the sparse forests of Arizona. Awanada was tied tightly to a weathered wooden post, her wrists raw and bleeding where the ropes had cut into her skin. Her sun-darkened face was streaked with soot and sweat, which mingled with scratches carved by the brush. In the distance, wolves howled a chilling, echoing cry that rang through the valley. Perched on dry branches, vultures waited, black wings outstretched, eyes fixed on the still-breathing figure below. Beneath the underbrush, hyenas crept, their eerie, broken laughter slicing through the night. The forest had become a prison, a place where the girl awaited her sentence. But Awanata did not cry. Her deep black eyes still burned with defiance. Her crime was not murder, nor betrayal. It was daring to stand against her cousin, Toharo, the man who had stolen her father's engraved silver blade, the family heirloom that symbolized honor and bloodline. For that, they had branded her a traitor. The men of the tribe turned their backs on her. The women lowered their gazes and said nothing. That brutal silence cut deeper than the ropes biting into her flesh. Awanata drew in a deep breath, ragged, but steady. She knew this night might be her last. But if she had to die, she would die with her head high, eyes unbowed not to Toharo, not to anyone. The wolves howled again, closer now. The circle of beasts was tightening. The night wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of fresh blood and cold sweat. Awanata strained against the ropes, but they were so tight that the coarse fibers had already sunk deep into her skin. Another long, mournful howl echoed closer. The wolves had formed a ring around her, their yellow eyes flashing in the dark. Overhead, vultures circled, wings spread wide like the shadow of death, and then the sound of hooves pounding against the earth broke through the stillness. From the darkness emerged a tall, lean figure on horseback. The moonlight lit his sun-worn face and cold, steel-gray eyes. Elias Boone, a solitary rancher who lived on the edge of Dry Hollow, often rode night patrols to check on his cattle. He had seen the flicker of firelight through the trees and heard the strange pattern of howling. Instinct, honed from years as a scout, had led him here. Elias pulled his horse to a stop. Before him was a strange scene. A tall Apache woman tied to a post, surrounded by wild predators with hunger in their eyes. For a moment, he considered it might be a trap. The tribe sometimes used women as bait. But her eyes, deep, black, and burning, told him this was no trick. This was an execution. Without another thought, Elias raised his Winchester. The gunshot tore through the silence, loud and sharp. One wolf dropped with a yelp. The rest scattered into the trees, their howls fading. Even the hyenas slunk away, leaving only the sound of flapping wings overhead. He dismounted quickly and approached the post. Awanata tensed, eyes burning with both suspicion and fury. As Elias drew his knife to cut the ropes, she growled weakly in a voice laced with Apache and English. "Do not touch me. You white men are all enemies." Elias paused for a beat, then continued cutting. His voice was gravelly, calm. "I do not care who you are. Right now, if I do not cut you loose, the wild will tear you apart." The rope snapped. Awanata's powerful body collapsed against him. He staggered slightly from the weight, but caught her and steadied her, guiding her toward the horse. In that moment, Elias saw the bruises on her wrists, the calluses on her shaking hands. She did not look like a victim. She looked like someone they had wanted to break and leave for dead. He lifted her onto the saddle behind him, then spurred the horse forward, racing back into the night, leaving behind the post, the predators, and the silent sentence they had tried to carry out. Between gasping breaths, Awanata whispered, eyes shut tight, "Why? Did you save me?" Elias did not answer. He only pulled the reins tighter, his eyes fixed on the distant glow of the oil lamp in his lone cabin, as if that light, far off in the darkness, was the only answer he needed. Elias Boone's wooden cabin sat nestled in a narrow valley, surrounded on all sides by towering black pines. A warm yellow glow flickered from the oil lamp in the window on a cold desert night. This may have been the only place still holding any heat. The horse came to a stop, panting heavily after the long ride. Elias dismounted and eased Awanata down. Her knees buckled the moment her feet touched the ground. He helped her across the threshold and sat her down on a bench by the fire. The flickering flames lit up her dust-covered, sun-darkened face, and her deep black eyes still glimmered with suspicion. Elias pulled out a small knife and cut away the rope still digging into her wrist, revealing bruises and bleeding welts. "Do not touch me," Awanata growled, yanking her arm back, breath ragged and sharp. Elias looked at her, his steel-gray eyes cold as ice, but his voice remained calm and hoarse. "If you do not let me clean the wound, the infection will kill you, and that death is worse than any wild animal." He silently boiled water, crushed a handful of dried herbs, and applied them to her wrist. Awanada remained tense, eyes locked on every move he made, ready to resist at the slightest misstep. But as the warmth from the poultice seeped into her skin, she let out a faint sigh. Her broad shoulders trembled slightly, then went still. The cabin fell quiet. Only the crackle of burning logs and the sound of two strangers breathing filled the room. Elias brought her an old blanket and draped it over her shoulders. He did not ask questions. He did not speak much. Every action was firm, but never forceful. For the first time in countless days of abandonment, Awanata felt the presence of care, simple, quiet care, yet her pride stood tall as a wall between them. Her voice, hoarse from exhaustion and distrust, broke the silence. Why? Every man has turned away from me. But you did not? Elias paused, lighting his pipe. He looked out the window, where the silver moon cast its light across the trees. His voice came low and rough. Because I know what it feels like to be left behind. No further explanation, just that, and it was enough to make Awanata pause. For the first time, her dark eyes softened, not entirely trustful, but touched with curiosity. That night, Awanata curled up on the bench, while Elias leaned back against the wall, his rifle within reach. Neither truly slept, but they shared a roof. In the dim firelight, a cast-out warrior and a solitary rancher began to orbit each other, even if only in silence. News that Awanata had survived did not take long to spread. Within the tribe, those who once turned their backs on her began to whisper. Toharo, the man who had stolen her father's engraved silver knife, went pale when he heard. He had been certain that Awanata would die in the forest, torn apart by wild beasts. But now, if she returned bearing the marks of her bindings, the whole tribe would know the truth. That he was a liar, and a greedy one at that. Toharo could not let that happen. He gathered a few bloodthirsty young men, boys who lived off intimidation and theft. They sat around a fire, whispering plans. Awanata had to be erased completely. No loose ends. Meanwhile, in Dry Hollow, word spread just as fast. Folks gossiped that rancher Elias Boone had brought home a cursed Indian woman. At the saloon, the taunts came freely. Boone must have been alone too long. Now he's keeping one of the tribe's monsters for company. A man like him will bring trouble down on the whole valley. Elias heard these words while buying salt and flour. He said nothing. He simply stared back, that steel-gray gaze of his silencing the room. But inside, he knew. He had just been pushed even farther out of a community that had never truly welcomed him. At the cabin, Awanata could feel the weight of it all. Every time she stepped out to fetch water or split wood, she felt the eyes watching from a distance. Not with kindness, but with suspicion and disdain. She knew her presence was isolating Elias even more. One night, while Elias was checking the cattle pen, Awanata approached, placing her large hand on the fence. Her voice was low and hoarse, with a tremble beneath it. I can leave. This trouble, it is not yours. Elias tightened a rope around the post, then stood up and looked her in the eye. If I wanted to leave you to trouble, I would have left you to the wolves. Awanata said nothing, but in the moonlight, her deep black eyes held for the first time the flicker of something like trust. Elsewhere, Toharo gripped the hilt of his blade. A wicked grin danced across his lips beneath the flickering firelight. He would not allow Awanata another breath of peace. The darkness was closing in around the lonely wooden cabin where two outcasts were just beginning to learn how to live together. Thank you for being here. If this story brought back memories of old times, dusty sunsets, and the echo of hoofbeats in your chest, consider subscribing to my channel, so that each day we can sit together again. And I will tell you another tale from the West. In the days that followed, the small cabin slowly became a place where two strangers began to learn how to live side by side. Elias Boone kept his solitary routines as a rancher, rising at the first rooster's crow, checking the fences, leading cattle to the fields, and stacking hay by sundown. But now, he no longer did it alone. Awanata, with her tall frame and hardened muscles, began to share the labor. At first, Elias gave her simple tasks, carrying water, sweeping the yard, but it did not take long before she was hauling thick logs from the barn, splitting firewood with swift, clean strikes that made Elias glance up in silent respect. Her rough hands were still marked and bleeding from the old rope burns, but she never once complained. On a scorching afternoon, Elias caught sight of her unwrapping the cloth around her arm and applying crushed dry herbs to the wound. He walked over, holding a small tin of his own. She tensed, eyes guarded. He simply set the tin down beside her, voice low and hoarse. "This one works better." Awanada stared at him for a long moment, then gave a quiet nod. For the first time, she let him dress her wound without protest. In the evening, they shared simple meals at the wooden table: corn cakes, dried beef, a pot of beans. Elias remained quiet, eating slowly. Awanada too said little, but sometimes her deep black eyes flickered with something like gratitude. In that silence, a fragile thread began to form between them. One day, Elias nearly stepped on a rattlesnake while checking the hay shed. The coiled serpent lay inches from the threshold, fangs gleaming. Awanada rushed in, axe in hand, and with a powerful swing, flung it away. Elias froze, steel-gray eyes locking onto her burning black ones. He gave a nod. "You just saved my life." Awanada replied, voice low but proud. "I cannot let you die, while I still owe you a life." The words made Elias smile, a rare, awkward smile, the first in many years of loneliness. Meanwhile, the rumors about Awanada and Elias kept spreading. People in town began to avoid the solitary rancher altogether. And deep in the woods, Toharo and his men prepared carefully. Bows, old rifles, axes, and traps. They would not allow his cousin and the white man to build anything lasting. That night, Elias sat on the porch, lighting his pipe, while Awanada sat beside the oil lamp sharpening her knife. Neither spoke a word, but both felt it this calm would not last, and when the storm came, they would have to stand together. There would be no turning back. The moon split the sky in half, its cold light casting a pale glow across the prairie. Elias Boone's wooden cabin stood alone in the dark, the dim yellow glow of an oil lamp flickering under the porch. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of gunpowder and scorched hay and omen. Elias's old dog barked in sharp, growling bursts, its fur standing on end. In the shadows, figures slithered out from the tree line. Toharo led them, hatred carved into his face, his hand clenched around an axe handle. Behind him were 3 young men armed with old rifles and gleaming bows. They crept around the cabin like wolves, murmuring their orders to strike. Inside, Elias watched through a narrow slit in the wall. He recognized the scent of ambush, a habit born from years as a scout. His voice was rough, steady. "They are here." Awanada gripped her long blade. Her black eyes blazed, though her limbs still ached. Her powerful frame tensed like that of a warrior. She did not ask. She did not flinch. She only gave a sharp nod. A shout rang out, then a flaming arrow slammed into the thatched roof. Fire exploded into the night, lighting up the sky. Instantly, Elias raised his Winchester. The first shot cracked the silence, dropping an attacker near the window. Awanada rolled aside and burst through the doorway, slicing through another man's bowstring with a ringing clash of steel. Toharo roared and charged, axe swinging. Awanada met the blow head-on, deflecting it with sheer force. The ground trembled beneath them. She struck back with a hammering punch, sending him reeling. The 2 towering figures collided, locked in brutal combat as flames raged around them. Inside, Elias fired again, then dragged a wooden table to brace the door. Smoke thickened. The roof groaned and cracked overhead. He shouted toward the flames, "Hold your ground, I've got your back." Awanada retreated, eyes reflecting the blaze, then lunged forward. Her blade carved through the air, tearing cloth and skin. Blood spilled hot onto scorched earth. 1 man screamed and fled. Only Toharo and 2 remained. The battle around the cabin became a true storm fire, smoke, bullets, and screams. Yet amid the chaos, Elias and Awanada stood like twin pillars unshaken. One with a rifle, one with a blade. Together, they pushed back wave after wave. As the flames licked the porch beams, Toharo stepped back, eyes burning with fury. He howled, "You will die tonight, Awanada, and the heirloom will be mine." Awanada clenched the silver knife, chest heaving, her deep black eyes locked onto him without blinking. The storm had come, and the final reckoning could no longer be avoided. Flames roared from the cabin roof, casting a fierce glow over Toharo's face, twisted in rage. He stood tall in the dirt yard, heavy axe in hand, eyes burning red like a cornered beast. Across from him, Awanada held her father's silver knife, the blade gleaming under the moonlight. Her hand was bloodied but steady. They charged at each other, steel clashed, echoing through the valley. Toharo swung his axe like a storm, each blow heavy enough to fell a tree. But Awanada dodged with sharp precision, her large frame moving fast, her muscles taut in the firelight. She countered with a wide slash, her blade slicing his arm. "You should have died in that forest," Toharo roared, lunging like a wild animal. Awanada answered with a thunderous cry and slammed her shoulder into him. The two bodies crashed to the ground, grappling violently. He shoved her head into the dirt, reaching for the silver knife, but she drove her knee up, flipping him over with the strength of her legs. They rolled in a circle of fire. Inside the cabin, Elias Boone fired shots to keep the last two attackers at bay. They fled into the night. He started toward the fight but stopped when he saw Awanada pinning Toharo down. He knew this was her battle to finish. Toharo pressed the axe close to her neck, blood heavy in the air. But Awanada twisted her knife and drove the tip deep into his upper arm. He howled in pain, the axe dropping from his grip. In that moment, she could have ended it. Her black eyes blazed. The silver blade hovered at his throat. All it would take was one pull. The yard fell silent, only the crackle of fire remained. Toharo panted, sweat and blood streaming down his face. The hatred in his eyes slowly turned to fear. Awanada's voice cut through the stillness, low and sharp as steel. "I do not need your blood to prove I belong." She threw the knife into the dirt, the blade sank deep into the mud. Her powerful hand still pinned him, but instead of killing him, she pushed him away and stood tall. Her bronze shoulders outlined in flame like a living statue. Toharo crumpled, defeated and humiliated. He stumbled backward, eyes filled with hate, but he no longer dared to step forward. His men were long gone, leaving him alone in the ashes. With a snarl, he turned and vanished into the night. Awanada stood still, chest rising and falling, her skin streaked with sweat and blood. She bent down and picked up her father's silver knife. This time, it was not a burden of legacy or revenge, it was proof of the path she had chosen for herself. Elias stepped out from the cabin, Winchester in hand, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers. He gave a slow nod, and his voice calm, rough, and warm broke the silence. "You won, in the only way a truly strong person ever does." As the fire began to die down, Awanada felt something for the first time: freedom. She was no longer the outcast. She was a warrior who had chosen her fate. The ashes of battle still smoldered, smoke and blood mingling in the drifting wind. Elias Boone planted the butt of his rifle into the dirt and stepped out of the fading firelight, his steel-gray eyes scanning the distant mountains, making sure no enemies remained. Beside him, Awanada stood silently, her father's silver knife clenched in her hand. Her sun-darkened face was streaked with sweat and soot, but her eyes now burned with something new, not hatred, but freedom. That night, they sat beneath the porch. Firelight from the cabin flickered behind them, casting shadows over the wounds on their bodies. Elias gently wrapped the torn skin on Awanada's arm. His rough hands met her hot, bruised flesh, not with fear, but with certainty. Awanada watched him closely, then whispered like a quiet confession, "I thought I would die alone in that forest. But you did not leave me behind." Elias looked up, his face stern but softening for a brief moment. "Everyone deserves a chance to live. I lost everything once. I do not want anyone else to face that alone." In the days that followed, they rebuilt the scorched cabin roof together, repaired the horse pen, split firewood, hauled water. Every hammer strike, every plank laid down carried the breath of a new beginning. Awanada, though her body still ached, stood beside him, her strong shoulders bearing just as much as his. To outsiders, they were a man and a woman. But between them, they were two souls who had walked through darkness and found light again. One evening, as the sun bathed the prairie in red, Elias sat on the porch steps, holding his worn cowboy hat. Awanada stepped out beside him, her father's silver knife glinting at her hip like a symbol. She sat beside him in silence. The wind passed through, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust, but for the first time in years, Elias did not feel alone. He leaned over, wrapping his strong arm around her broad shoulders. She did not pull away. She closed her eyes, letting that unfamiliar warmth settle in. In that moment, they were no longer a rancher and an outcast. They were two people who had found where they belonged. The story closes as the sun dips below the horizon, and the final embers fade inside the newly rebuilt cabin. On the porch, Elias and Awanada sit side by side, staring out across the vast, quiet land. No words are spoken, but the silence itself is a promise. From now on, neither would face the storms alone. This home would shelter them both, no matter how harsh the West became. Dear friends, in the Wild West, guns and dust may take much away, but one thing they can never steal is the longing for a home. A rancher and an abandoned woman found each other amid ashes and darkness. Love does not need a vow, only the courage to reach for another's hand in the heart of the storm. That is real strength, the kind that lets people stand tall in the driest desert. It has been an honor to share this journey with you, dear listeners of Wild West Storytelling. I truly wish that wherever you are, peace and happiness follow. I love you all. Tell me what you thought about this story. Drop a comment below. Type in if you enjoyed it. And do not forget to subscribe channel for more dramatic stories from the American frontier. The crowd pressed in, screaming like wild beasts. Amid the roar, a noose swung in the air, and at the end of it was the tall figure of an Apache woman. Takina. Her skin was sun-darkened, her bare feet kicked helplessly, and her face, streaked with dust, still carried an air of unyielding pride. The rope left a harsh mark around her neck, yet her deep black eyes stared defiantly down at the crowd as if to say, "I am not afraid of you." On the wooden platform, Judge Malcolm Avery, a man in a black robe and a white cravat, raised his hand and declared in a flat, mechanical voice, like a verdict, long predetermined, "This is the fate of a traitor. An Apache spy must die so that the law may have peace." The crowd roared in agreement. Rocks and bottles flew through the air as dust rose like a storm. At the edge of the square, a lone figure leaned against a fence post. Elias Boone, a rancher who had lived alone on the frontier for 8 years, stood still as a statue, but his steely gray eyes were fixed on those feet still struggling in the air. In that moment, he knew she was not dead. Hot wind lashed across the square, carrying with it the scent of smoke, sweat, and injustice. Elias clenched his fists, his heart pounding like a war drum. He had not come here to interfere. But now, the choice was no longer his to make. Elias Boone was not one of the crowd. For the past 8 years, since the day a plague took his wife and child, he had chosen to live far from the town of Deadwood Crossing, on a small ranch nestled into the hillside, where only the wind and an old horse kept him company. People said he was distant, hard to talk to, and maybe they were right. Elias rarely set foot in a saloon, nor did he take part in the cruel jokes of frontier life. But this morning, when he rode into town to buy some salt and iron nails, Elias reined in his horse at a scene that weighed heavy on his heart. A woman being hanged. Not a thief or a murderer, but a young Apache woman, tall and strong, her hands bound behind her back, her body swaying from a rope. To the crowd, she was just another redskin savage. But to Elias, the image brought back the memory of a long-gone afternoon, when his own father had been wrongfully sentenced by the very same law of the powerful. Elias gripped the bag of salt in his hand, his face cold as stone, though inside, a storm was rising. People said that the law was justice, but he had lived long enough to know. The law belongs to the strong, and justice belongs to those brave enough to keep their conscience intact. As the crowd slowly dispersed, certain that Takina was dead, Elias remained, unmoving, like an old oak rooted beside the square. His gray eyes never left the faint movement in the woman's chest. One breath, then another. She was still alive. In that moment, Elias knew his life was about to change. He could turn away, as he had turned away from the world for 8 long years. Or he could step forward, cut the rope, and become the hunted. The shadow of Judge Avery had just vanished behind the gallows. Elias slowly placed the bag of salt on the ground. His calloused hand rested gently on the handle of the revolver at his hip. His lips pressed together. The lines around his eyes deepened with quiet resolve. He had never gone looking for trouble. But this time, trouble had come looking for him. Deadwood Crossing Square was now nothing but red dust, the scent of sweat, and broken glass glittering under the sunday. The crowd had drifted off, some back to the saloon, others to their daily chores, leaving behind what they believed was a lifeless body hanging from the cottonwood branch. Only Elias Boone remained, his cowboy hat pulled low to shade half his face, eyes locked on the faint rise and fall of the woman's chest. He walked toward her slowly, each step crushing lines of dust beneath his boots. The creaking of the rope cut through the silence, drilling into his ears. A black crow perched on an oak branch cried out hoarsely, like a funeral song. Elias said nothing. The hunting knife flashed in his hand, and with one swift, clean cut, the rope snapped. Takina dropped, her heavy body slamming into Elias's chest. He sank to his knees, still holding her tightly, keeping her head from striking the hard ground. Her breath, hot and ragged, hit his neck, carrying the scent of blood and dust. She was alive, but barely. "Do not let them." Her voice was dry and broken, barely more than a whisper. "Hush, easy now," Elias replied, gently pressing a finger to her lips. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met his, a cold steel gray. Hers, deep and dark, both filled with scars only the soul could carry. He did not have much time. If Avery's men returned, they would kill them both. Elias hoisted Takina over his shoulder. She was tall, but still fit securely in his weathered arms. He lifted her onto the back of his old horse, then threw a wool coat over her to hide the bruises. The road out of town burned like hot coals. Elias did not look back. Behind him, he could hear the murmurs begin. "Where's Boone going with that body?" "He's asking for trouble." Elias urged the horse into a faster trot, dust trailing behind him like smoke. The sparse woods ahead opened into land that only he knew. His cabin sat tucked on a hillside, where the wind howled through the trees and few people ever came. When he laid Takina down on the rough wooden bed, Elias saw the full extent of her wounds. Rope burns carved deep into her neck, bruises along her shoulders, and feet scraped raw and bleeding. He brought cool water and began cleaning her injuries, his hands clumsy but patient. Takina opened her eyes and stared at him. "Why? Did you save me?" Her voice was faint, the words barely formed. Elias paused for a moment. His steel-gray eyes darkened slightly. "Because justice does not belong to the judge. And you did not deserve to die." Rumors in Deadwood Crossing spread like fire through dry grass. People whispered in the saloon, along the dirt roads, even outside the general store. Elias Boone, the lone rancher, had cut down an Apache she-wolf. Some called it madness. Others said he had betrayed the town. But no matter what was said, all suspicious eyes turned toward the small ranch on the hillside. Judge Malcolm Avery did not let the news pass without action. He was a man used to wielding power like a whip, and anyone who defied his rulings had to pay. One morning, 2 riders in long dusters knocked on the door of Elias's cabin. "Boone," one of them barked. "Word is you are harboring an Apache spy. The judge wants the truth." Elias stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the wooden frame, his steel-gray eyes cold and steady. "It is just me and my old horse here. If you are looking for a spy, maybe you should try looking in a mirror." The words hit hard. The deputy's face darkened with anger, but instead of picking a fight, they spat on the ground and turned their horses away, leaving behind a cold warning. "Next time, we are bringing fire, Boone, and you won't be walking away from it." Inside the cabin, Takina had heard everything. The rope marks still lined her face, but her eyes burned bright. They will come back and not to ask questions. They will burn it all. That is how they spread fear. Elias took off his hat and sat by the doorframe. He knew she was right. 8 years of isolation had taught him how to avoid trouble. But this time, trouble had wrapped itself around his life like barbed wire. "Why do they hate you so much?" Elias asked, his voice low. Takina hesitated, then answered in a hoarse whisper. "They say I passed messages to Apache warriors, that I led them to the white settlers' camp. But the truth is, I was just looking for my sister. I was captured. From that moment on, the word spy was nailed to my name." Elias fell silent, his calloused hands tightening into fists. He realized then that this woman was not just a victim, she was a tool, a scapegoat for Avery to tighten his grip on power. Night fell. The glow from the town lit the distant sky. The scent of smoke still lingered in the wind. In the cabin's dim light, Elias cleaned Takina's wounds. Their eyes met in silence. Outside, the storm had not yet come, but both of them knew it was only a matter of time. "Thank you so much for being here. If this story brings back memories of dusty afternoons and the sound of hooves echoing in your chest, Then go ahead and subscribe to my channel, so every day we can sit together, and I will tell you another tale from the Wild West. The night wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the blistering heat of the dry season. Elias Boone's small wooden cabin sat in darkness, lit only by the crackling flames in the fireplace, casting shadows of two figures facing each other. There was no need for many words. Both Elias and Takina understood. Judge Avery's men would return, and next time, they would bring the fire of destruction. Elias opened an old wooden chest and pulled out a rusted Winchester rifle and a few leftover boxes of ammunition. His hands were strong and steady, more used to mending fences than taking lives, but now, every skill from his younger days had to be recalled. He cleaned the barrel of the gun, each motion slow and deliberate. Takina was different. She stepped outside and sharpened wooden branches, planting them around the horse pen in rows like a barrier of stakes. Her forearms were corded with muscle, old scars scattered across her skin under the moonlight, but she stood strong like a bronze statue. Elias watched from the window, quietly surprised by her fierce determination. "You work like a man," Elias said softly, half a compliment, half a concern. Takina looked up, her dark eyes sharp. "I am not a man. I am Apache, and we learn to survive from the moment we can walk." A brief silence fell between them, broken only by the wind wailing along the hillside. Elias nodded, offering no argument. He picked up an oil can and began dousing the ground around the horse pen, attaching a fuse to a bundle of dry kindling. If they tried to set a fire, the explosion would scatter the horses and buy them time. When the preparations were done, the two of them sat by the fire on the porch. Takina's face was set like stone, but the flames dancing in her eyes revealed exhaustion beneath her strength. Elias handed her a steaming bowl of black coffee. "You could leave tonight," he said slowly. "If you take the northern trail, you'll be free." Takina shook her head. "No, I have run too many times. Tonight, I stay with you. I will fight." Her words left Elias quiet for a long moment. Something stirred in his chest, something unfamiliar. It was more than the duty of saving a life. It was the feeling of standing together. They were no longer strangers, but two battered souls, thrown together by fate, now holding the same line. The moon rose high. In the distance, the sound of hooves echoed faintly like the drums of war. Elias Boone tightened his grip around the rifle. Takina slipped a dagger beneath her pillow. They both knew. Tonight, this land would be stained with blood. The night in Deadwood Crossing burned bright like the gates of hell had been thrown open. From afar, the glow of torches lit up the dark sky, accompanied by the thunder of hooves pounding the earth. Judge Avery rode at the front, his black cloak whipping in the wind, his voice ringing out like a funeral bell. Tonight, all who defy justice will burn. More than a dozen gunmen surrounded Elias's ranch. Torches were hurled into the horse pen, and flames erupted with a roar. From the shadows, Elias yanked the fuse cord. A deafening blast tore through the night fire, devoured the rotting wooden roof, and 3 of Avery's men were blown off their feet. Screams and the shrieking of panicked horses echoed across the valley. In the chaos, Takina burst from the back door like a shadowed panther. Her dagger gleamed in the firelight as it slashed across a man's arm, blood streaking in crimson arcs. She melted into the smoke, disappearing and reappearing like a ghost, terrifying the invaders with every strike. Elias stood at the front of the cabin, the Winchester thundering in his hands, each shot precise, cold, final. With every pull of the trigger, one of Avery's men dropped, but they kept coming. The torches crept closer. Finally, Avery rode straight into the yard, revolver flashing in the firelight. "Boone, you chose to stand with a savage. Tonight, you die with her." Elias dropped the empty Winchester, drawing his Colt from his belt. The two men faced each other, the flames dancing in their eyes, one cold as steel, the other burning with hate. Avery fired first. The bullet grazed Elias's shoulder, spraying blood across his shirt. But Elias did not fall. He steadied his hand, pulled the trigger. Judge Avery tumbled from his horse and lay still in the red dust. The gunfire ceased. Avery's men scattered in panic, dropping torches and abandoning their fallen. The yard was silent now, only the scent of smoke, the taste of blood, and the heavy breathing of two souls who had stood their ground. Takina, her hair matted with sweat and blood, stepped toward Elias. She held him steady with strong arms, her dark eyes blazing beneath the dying flames. You chose the hardest path, she whispered. Elias gave a faint nod, his breath ragged. No, I just chose the right one. Dawn cast a pale golden light over the Deadwood Valley. The small cabin stood silently amid the lingering smoke of the horse pen, now reduced to charred ash. There were no more hoofbeats, no more shouting, only the wind, carrying the scent of smoke into every crack of the wooden walls. Elias Boone sat on the porch steps, his shirt stained with blood, the wound in his shoulder still aching. He poured a bit of water from his canteen, let it run over the injury, and watched as the mixture of water and blood soaked into the dry earth. Takina stepped outside. Her hair was matted with sweat and smoke, her face streaked with dust, but her deep, dark eyes burned bright. They sat in silence for a long time, as if listening for the beat of their own hearts after a night that had nearly taken everything. Then Takina spoke, her voice hoarse but steady. Last night, they thought they could burn everything to the ground. But they do not understand. Fire only makes steel stronger. Elias looked up, the corner of his mouth lifting in a tired smile. He gazed out over the scorched fields, then turned back to her. You are no spy. You are proof that the truth will never stay buried. Takina tightened her grip around the dull-bladed dagger, her hand trembling slightly from exhaustion. But there was light in her eyes as if, for the first time in years, someone had truly seen her for who she was. Inside the cabin, a new fire crackled to life. Takina set a pot of water on the stove. White steam curled into the air, mingling with the bitter scent of coffee that Elias had just brewed. Two people, two battered souls pushed to the edge, now sat beneath the same roof, sharing a silence that no longer felt heavy but comforting. Outside, the sun was rising higher, casting light on the scars across the land and across their bodies. And yet, that same light signaled a new beginning, something both Elias and Takina had long believed was lost forever. Elias lifted his wooden cup gently toward her. We are alive. And we have a new day to start again. Takina nodded, her eyes glowing like embers just stirred to flame. The morning sun stretched across the rolling hills, revealing blackened scorch marks still scattered around the ranch. Elias Boone stood before the broken fence, his calloused hand resting on a charred beam. He knew it would take days to rebuild everything, but to him, this was more than repair. It was a declaration that the fire from last night had not consumed his life. Takina stepped out, her long black hair tousled, her leather shirt still carrying the scent of smoke. In her hands was a wooden bucket drawn from the well, her strong arms glistening with droplets of water. She set the bucket down beside Elias, her deep, dark eyes shining with quiet resolve. I used to think I had to leave, she said softly. Head north, find my sister, keep running, always hunted. But last night, standing with you against the flames, I realized running is just another kind of dying. I want to stay. I want to rebuild from the ashes, not run from them anymore. Elias turned to look at her, his steel-gray eyes seeming to search the depths of her soul. He did not answer right away. Instead, he picked up the hammer leaning against the fence and handed it to her. This ranch could use a strong pair of hands. If you stay, this will be your home. Takina took the hammer, her lips pressed tight, but her eyes gleamed with a new kind of light, not the fire of vengeance, but the spark of hope. The two of them set to work. Elias rebuilt the fence while Takina drove in the scorched posts, her strength driving them deep into the dry earth with a single swing. Now and then, they exchanged brief glances, no words needed. A rancher once lost in solitude, a warrior once cast out, now working side by side, like two broken pieces finding their place. By evening, the breeze carried the scent of burnt grass, mixing with the rich aroma of black coffee rising from the cabin. On the porch steps, Elias and Takina sat quietly, watching the sun sink beneath a sky painted in deep red. Outside, the land still bore traces of ash, but inside, something new was taking root. Elias spoke, his voice low and steady, like a final note to the story. This land has been stained with blood, but it will turn green again, as long as there are people willing to stay and plant anew. Takina tilted her head slightly, letting a rare smile bloom across her face. And in that moment, they both understood the road ahead would still be wild and stormy. But at least, they would no longer walk it alone. Through this story, I just wanted to revisit a part of the past, one filled with dust, fire, and blood, a time when the strong often claimed to be the law, But today, things have changed. We live in a world of laws, of justice that protects each and every person. What you just heard is only an echo of a time long gone. And that is why we must cherish the present, live with integrity, and respect the law always. Above all, I hope you live a happy and peaceful life. I love you all, my dear listeners of Wild West Storytelling. Let me know what you thought about this story. Drop a comment below. Type the number 1 if you enjoyed it. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more thrilling tales from the Wild West. Jonas Hale was splitting firewood when he caught a glimpse of a figure. It swayed unsteadily on the dirt road leading to his ranch. It was an Apache woman. She was tall and muscular, but her body looked drained, barely holding itself up. Her animal hide dress was torn and caked with dust. Her wrists were swollen and raw with rope marks. Her sharp, once beautiful face was pale, streaked with sweat and dried blood across her cheeks. She staggered closer to the gate, trying to grip the wooden post, but her hands were trembling. She barely managed to lift her deep, dark eyes toward the rancher before whispering in a hoarse voice, "Please, water." That short plea was all she could manage before her large frame collapsed into the red dust. Jonas froze. After years of living alone, he was used to seeing guns, riders, even sun-dried animal carcasses out on the prairie. But this sight gripped something deep inside him. An Apache woman, all alone and pushed to this point she had to have survived something horrific. He hesitated, his steely gray eyes scanning the open fields behind her, waiting to see if anyone else might be coming. But there was nothing, only the wind and the dust. At last, Jonas stepped forward, took off his wide-brimmed hat, and bent down to lift her into his arms. As he stood on the old wooden porch, his heart was pounding not from fear, but from the unshakable sense that from this moment on, the quiet solitude he had known for so long would never be the same again. Jonas pushed open the wooden door of the cabin, his shoulders straining as he lowered the Apache woman onto the narrow bed he had slept in for years. The room was bare, cracked wooden walls, a rough-hewn table, and a cold fireplace. He poured a glass of water and held it gently to her dry, cracked lips. She swallowed in tiny sips, her eyes still half closed, her breathing rapid like someone who had just escaped the desert. Jonas sat down in a chair, his calloused hands gripping the handle of his axe, trying to steady the unease building inside him. Who was this Apache woman? Why was she wandering in such a desperate state? Could it be a trap? After all these years, he had learned the brutal truth of this land. Behind one fallen soul could be an entire gang lying in wait. He stood and pulled back the curtain to peer outside. The sky was blistering bright, the prairie patchy with dust, and not a soul in sight. Only the wind whistling through the broken fence. A sound behind him made Jonas turn. The woman's eyes were open now, deep, dark, and wary. She braced herself to sit up, but her arms were trembling, the bruises so deep they made her veins stand out. Jonas reached out to help, but she pushed his hand away with a glare sharp as a blade. "Do not touch me." He froze, then slowly placed the glass of water on the table, speaking in a calm, steady voice. "No one here is going to hurt you. You can rest." She said nothing. Her broad shoulders rose and fell with heavy breaths, but her eyes stayed filled with suspicion. Jonas recognized that look like a wild animal cornered, worn down but still ready to strike if pushed. Instead of arguing, he quietly took a clean cloth, dipped it in water, and set it on the table. "If you want, you can wrap your wounds yourself," Jonas said, then turned his back and began lighting a fire in the stove. The flames flickered to life, casting moving shadows on the wooden walls, lighting up the woman's powerful but exhausted body. A long time passed before she finally spoke, her voice rough and hollow, every word falling like a stone. "I have nowhere else to go." Jonas looked up, his gaze resting on her face, a mix of fierceness and brokenness. He asked no questions. Out here, everyone carried wounds from the past, and sometimes, silence was the deepest form of respect. The cabin settled into quiet, save for the gentle crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind spun red dust into little whirlwinds. Inside, a lonely rancher and a lost Apache woman, 2 lives left behind, sat together under one roof for the first time. The next morning, early sunlight slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls, carrying with it the lingering scent of wood smoke. Jonas had been up for hours, already settled into the rhythm of ranch life, checking the cattle pens, repairing a broken fence, hauling water from the well. When he stepped back inside, he saw the Apache woman struggling to stand. One trembling hand gripped the edge of the table as she tried to shove her feet into a pair of worn, broken-down boots. "Where are you going?" Jonas asked, his voice low, not unkind. She did not look at him. Instead, she bent down to pick up a torn shawl and hastily threw it over her shoulders. "Do not worry. I owe no one favors. I will leave." Her voice was hoarse, tinged with a faint tremble, like even her body was protesting the decision. Jonas stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. He could see it clearly now. Every movement she made was slow and labored, like her strength had been drained. Her wrists were swollen, her bare feet cracked and streaked with dried blood. It was obvious. If she walked out now, the midday sun and swirling red dust outside would swallow her whole long before she found shelter. He sighed, pulled off his leather gloves, and tossed them on the table. "If you want to leave, I will not stop you. But this cabin has room for one more. Stay a few days, at least until you can stand on your own." The woman froze. She turned her face toward him. Her dark, deep-set eyes burned with both suspicion and pride. "Why?" Jonas lifted his head, those steel-gray eyes meeting hers. "Because I cannot let someone die on my doorstep. That is all." For a moment, everything seemed to fall silent. The fire crackled behind them. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the wooden walls. She stared at him, as if searching for deceit in every weathered line of his sun-tanned face. But all she saw was grit, honesty, and a deep, silent sorrow that had never been spoken aloud. Finally, she let the shawl slip from her hands and fall to the floor. Her breath escaped in a heavy sigh, like someone surrendering after a long battle. "Fine. I will stay. Just for a few days." Jonas gave a small nod, saying nothing more. He stepped back out into the yard to finish the chores he had left behind, leaving her alone in the quiet cabin. The days that followed passed slowly, like the steady rhythm of a hammer driving fence posts into the ground. The Apache woman still had not said her name. She simply stayed in the cabin without protest. At first, she sat quietly in the corner, her dark eyes watching Jonas work out in the yard, like a wild bird held temporarily in a cage. But little by little, she began to help. One early morning, when Jonas came back from hauling water from the well, he found the stove already lit. The faint smell of roasted corn hung in the air. A plate of rough, warm cornbread sat on the table, next to his old tin mug. She did not say a word. She just sat there, quietly wrapping another cloth around her swollen wrist. Jonas glanced at her, gave a slight nod, and sat down to eat. Neither of them spoke, but the silence carried an unspoken agreement they would share the small things around this home. On the third day, while Jonas was chopping wood, he saw her step outside. Her frame was strong, but her movements were still stiff. She awkwardly picked up pieces of firewood, dropping them into the basket one by one. "You do not have to," he started to say, but when he met that stubborn look in her eyes, he fell silent and let her do it. From that moment on, they worked side by side. She mended the torn sleeve of his old shirt, and he patched up the leaky porch roof where the night rain used to sneak in. One afternoon, a dust storm swept across the prairie. Jonas was herding the livestock into the barn when he saw her. She was bracing herself against the door, using her shoulder to push the heavy wood shut. The wind roared, trying to rip it open. Her back trembled from the effort, sweat tracing lines across her sun-darkened skin. But her eyes were fierce with the kind of resolve you would see in any warrior. When the door slammed shut, Jonas reached for the latch, and his fingers brushed against hers, calloused, strong, but trembling for just a fleeting moment. Later, inside the cabin, they sat near the fire. Jonas poured her another cup of water. She looked up at him and, for the first time since she arrived, spoke words out loud. "You are not like the others." Jonas did not ask who she meant by the others. He simply took a sip of water and replied plainly, "Out here, everybody carries their own scars. I do not dig into yours. You do not dig into mine." The Apache woman gave a quiet nod. Silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was no longer guarded or hostile. It felt like the first trace of a truce, two strangers, both left behind, now quietly leaning on each other in a small wooden cabin in the wild. "Thank you for being here," If this story brought back memories of dusty afternoons and the sound of hooves echoing through your heart, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, so that every day we can sit together once more. And I will tell you another story from the West. It was a sweltering afternoon. The air so thick with heat it felt like it could stop time. Jonas was fitting a horseshoe on an old mare when, in the distance, the steady clang of iron hooves echoed across the dusty ground. He looked up and saw a lone rider approaching. A long coat hung heavy with dust, a low-brimmed hat shadowed half his face, and sunlight glinted off the grip of a revolver strapped to his hip. The Apache woman stood on the cabin porch, her dark eyes narrowed, her body tensing like a drawn bow. Jonas could see her hands trembling slightly, as if something deep inside her already knew this man brought nothing good. The rider stopped at the gate, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, and spoke in a high, sneering voice. "I am here to collect what is owed. That woman was sold. Got her husband's signature right here. She belongs to me." Jonas set the hammer down and stepped forward, planting himself firmly in the middle of the yard. His sun-hardened face showed no reaction, but his steel-gray eyes locked onto the stranger with a quiet, dangerous weight. He spoke slowly, each word hitting the ground like a nail. "There is nothing here that belongs to you." The drifter laughed harshly, flicking his eyes toward the Apache woman. "You think keeping her is going to make your life better? A woman like that is trouble. Her last owner did not even want her. Now it is your turn to find out why." Jonas said nothing. His hand moved subtly to rest on the handle of the Colt at his hip. He did not draw. It was just enough for the man to understand he was ready. The wind swept across the prairie, kicking up dust. The tension grew so thick, every stomp of the horse's hooves seemed louder than thunder. For a moment, it felt like a gunfight was about to break out. The Apache woman gripped the edge of the doorframe, her heart pounding, eyes locked on Jonas. For the first time in her life, a man was not stepping aside when someone tried to claim her like property. The drifter spat in the dirt and let the paper fly off into the wind. "I will be back. Next time, I will not come alone." He turned his horse and rode off, leaving behind a trail of red dust that clung to the back of the throat. When he was gone, silence settled like a heavy blanket. The Apache woman stepped out from under the porch roof, her body still coiled with tension. Jonas turned to her, his voice low and firm. "That piece of paper means nothing. And you are not something a man can just take." Her cracked lips trembled. In her dark eyes, fear slowly gave way to something else, something flickering and unfamiliar. Hope. The fire crackled in the stove, casting shadows across the weathered wooden walls. Jonas sat in his wooden chair, steel-gray eyes fixed on the flames, as if trying to pull pieces of the past from the dancing light. Across from him sat Naeli, the Apache woman still wrapped in makeshift bandages. The warmth of the fire touched her sun-darkened face, revealing the bruises and the hollow circles beneath her eyes. For a long while, the only sound was the wind whistling through the cracks in the door. Then Naeli spoke, her voice rough and low, like a confession whispered in the dark. "I grew up in the tribe, always seen as a burden. My father died young. My mother was weak. When I came of age, they forced me to marry a man I did not choose. He treated me like property, beat me when I displeased him, sold me when he needed money. I got used to the looks of contempt, used to being tied up, left behind." She paused. Her dark eyes shimmered in the firelight. Her hand clenched the hem of her skirt, shoulders trembling slightly. Jonas drew a slow breath, letting the words come at their own pace. "I had a family once, too. A kind wife. A little boy. Then the fever came, a few years back. Took them both, right in front of me, and I could not do a damn thing to stop it. After that, I chose to live alone. Buried myself in work. It was easier than facing the empty space inside." He lowered his head, a calloused hand rubbing across his brow, his voice thick. "Some days, I wondered what reason I had to wake up at all, until the day you knocked on this gate." The cabin settled into silence again. The firelight flickered in their eyes that had seen too much pain, but now held a glimmer of something else. Understanding. Naeli slowly reached her bruised and swollen hand across the table between them. Jonas looked up, and his eyes met hers deep, dark, and still. He did not speak. He simply laid his rough hand gently over hers. No promises, no vows, just a single, uncertain touch enough to push back the shadows of years spent forgotten. Outside, the wind stirred red dust across the prairie, but inside the cabin, the fire warmed more than just their bodies. It began to thaw two souls long turned to stone. At dawn the next morning, golden light poured through the small window, casting long shadows across the dusty wooden walls of the cabin. Jonas had been outside for hours, already deep into his daily rancher's routine, watering the horses, checking the herd, patching up a sagging section of fence. When he came back in, he found Naili standing quietly by the door, folding a few scraps of cloth into a small bundle. "Where are you going?" Jonas asked, his voice steady, no blame, no demand. Naili turned, her dark eyes heavy. "I do not want to be a burden. The longer I stay, the more trouble I bring you." Her voice caught, as if even saying the words weighed her down. Jonas stood still, his calloused hands tightening around his worn leather gloves. He looked at her tall but weary frame, the shoulders that had once stood so strong, now slumped under the weight of too many years being cast aside. He understood. She was not afraid of work or hunger. What she feared was being pushed away again. He stepped forward, his steel-gray gaze calm and quiet. "Naili, you owe me nothing, but I need to say this. If you leave now, there will be nowhere safe for you. And me. I do not want to see this cabin empty again." Naili bit her lip. A single tear traced down her sun-darkened cheek, catching the morning light like a thread of silver. Her voice trembled, yet her words were firm. "I have no place to go anymore." The confession landed like a truth she had carried for too long, painful, but freeing. Jonas paused, then gave a slow nod. "Then, let this be home." In that moment, the space between them vanished. Jonas reached out, hesitantly brushing her hand with his. This time, she did not pull away. Her fingers trembled, but she let them rest in his. They stood close now, eyes locked, filled with loss, longing, and a fragile trust just beginning to take root. Their first kiss came slowly, soft as the morning wind, but certain as a vow. No words were needed. The warmth of that touch said everything. From this day on, neither of them would face the world alone. A new season had arrived. The prairie had changed its coat. After the first summer rains, the grass stretched out in endless green waves, and tiny wildflowers bloomed beneath the golden Sunday. The breeze drifted through the wooden fence, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh grass, cooler and more refreshing than any drink Jonas had ever tasted. The cabin, once dark and quiet, now glowed with new life. Naili, though still marked by scars and lingering pain, had embraced the rhythm of daily chores. She laid out corn to dry in the yard, cleaned the stables, her strong shoulders and calloused hands never shying away from dirt or hard work. Jonas patched the porch roof, and together, they built a small pen for chickens. Meals were no longer silent. Between the clinks of spoons on bowls, soft laughter sometimes broke through a clumsy story from Jonas, or a rare glimmer in Naili's eyes when he stumbled through a memory from the past. In the nearby town, there were still doubtful glances whenever the Apache woman walked beside Jonas. But unlike before, Naili no longer looked down. She walked tall, her sun-darkened face calm and steady. Because now, beside her, there was always a man who stood like a pillar no words needed to show the world. She was no longer alone. At dusk, the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of burning red. Jonas sat on the wooden steps, his arm wrapped gently around Naili's shoulders. She leaned into him, smiling softly. Her large hands rested over his, and in that silent clasp, there was a vow spoken not with words, but with touch. Crickets sang. The wind whispered across the soft grass. Nothing seemed extraordinary, yet for two souls once abandoned and broken, this moment was nothing short of a miracle. Jonas looked out across the fields, his heart light like breathing freely for the first time in years. He knew. From a lonely rancher, he had become a man with a family, with a reason to keep going. And Naili, the once outcast Apache woman, had finally found a home. Not from a tribe, not through a marriage paper, but through her choice to stay. On the old wooden porch, beneath the fiery sunset, they sat side by side, saying nothing because both of them understood, tomorrow, and all the days after, they would never be alone again. Dear friends, in the wild frontier, where dust and gunfire often shape a man's fate, there are still things stronger than wounds, love, and healing. Jonas and Naili did not find each other through promises or sweet words. They met in the ruins of what had once been whole. He was a lonely rancher, hollowed by loss. She was an abandoned Apache woman, scarred and hardened by cruelty. And yet, in the wreckage, they found one another. Love is not some magic that erases the past. It is two hands reaching across the hurt, holding on through pain and silence. A glance, a gentle touch, or something as simple as a cup of water left on the table. These are the quiet miracles that bring life back to broken hearts. Because no matter how strong we are, all of us crave a place to belong, to be seen, to be valued. Out on the wide prairie, they rebuilt a home from ashes. And in that home, they learned to trust again, to discover that love not only binds two hearts, it heals the very soul. It has been a joy to share this journey with you, dear viewers of Wild West storytelling. I truly hope happiness and peace always find their way to your heart. I love each and every one of you. Let me know what you thought of this story. Leave a comment below. Type 1 if you enjoyed the story. And do not forget to subscribe channel for more gripping tales from the